In a quiet little town surrounded by thick woods and winding roads, there lived a dog named Rusty. He was a small brown mutt with big hopeful eyes and a heart full of love. Rusty didn't care about fancy things. He didn't need a shiny collar or a big house. All he needed was his owner, Mark, a quiet man who lived in a rundown home at the edge of the forest. To Rusty, Mark was everything. The one who tossed the tennis ball, scratched his ears, and called him a good boy. They were a team, just the two of them, happy in their simple life. But one chilly day, everything changed. Mark left with a black bag over his shoulder, promising, "I'll be back soon." Rusty watched him disappear down the path, his tail wagging, sure his owner would return. Days turned into weeks, weeks into years, and Rusty never left the porch. He waited, loyal and patient, while the town whispered about Mark's absence. What Rusty didn't know was that the bag held a dark secret, a secret that would break his world apart and lead him to a truth he could never imagine. In a small, sleepy town surrounded by tall trees and winding dirt roads, there lived a dog named Rusty. He was a little brown mutt, not too big, not too small, with soft fur that looked like the color of autumn leaves. His eyes were big and round, always shining with hope, like he believed something good was just around the corner. Rusty wasn't fancy, no shiny collar or special tricks, but he had a heart full of love, and all of that love belonged to one person, his owner, Mark. Mark was a quiet man, the kind who didn't talk much to anyone. He had dark hair that fell over his forehead, and a smile that seemed friendly enough, though it never quite reached his eyes. To the people in town, Mark was just another guy, someone who kept to himself, living in a tiny house at the edge of the woods. The house wasn't much to look at: peeling paint, a creaky porch, and a rusty mailbox that leaned to one side. But to Rusty, it was home. It was where he and Mark spent their days together, where Mark would toss an old tennis ball across the yard, and Rusty would chase it with a wagging tail, barking like it was the best game in the world. Every morning, Mark would sit on the porch with a cup of coffee, and Rusty would lie at his feet, resting his head on Mark's boots. "You're a good boy, Rusty," Mark would say, scratching behind the dog's ears. Rusty didn't understand all the words, but he knew the sound of Mark's voice and the warmth of his hand. That was enough. To Rusty, Mark was everything. His friend, his family, his whole world. Then one day something changed. It was a chilly afternoon, the kind where the wind carried a bite and the sky turned gray, like it couldn't decide if it wanted to rain. Mark came out of the house carrying a black bag slung over his shoulder. It wasn't a bag Rusty had seen before. It looked heavy, and it made a soft clinking sound as Mark moved. Rusty tilted his head, curious, his ears perked up. Mark knelt down in front of him, his face serious. "I'll be back soon, Rusty," he said, his voice low and quick. "You stay here. Be good." He patted Rusty's head once, then stood up, turned and walked away. Rusty watched as Mark disappeared down the dirt path that led into the woods, the black bag bouncing against his back. At first Rusty wasn't worried. Mark had left before, sometimes to the store, sometimes to town, and he always came back. So Rusty sat by the front door, his tail wagging, his eyes fixed on the path. He waited, sure that any minute he'd hear Mark's footsteps or see his shadow coming through the trees. The sun sank lower, painting the sky orange and pink, then faded into darkness. Still no Mark. Rusty didn't move. He stayed right there, his little body curled up on the porch, waiting. The next morning came. Cold and quiet. Rusty stood up, stretched his legs, and looked down the path again. Nothing. No sign of Mark. His tail wagged a little slower, but he didn't give up. He sat back down, his nose twitching as he sniffed the air, hoping to catch Mark's familiar smell, sweat and coffee, and that faint hint of cigarettes. Hours passed. The neighbors started to notice. Old Mrs. Clara, who lived next door, peeked out her window and saw Rusty still sitting there. "Poor thing," she muttered, shaking her head. She brought him a bowl of water and some leftover chicken, setting it on the porch. "Mark must have gone somewhere," she said to herself. Rusty lapped up the water and ate the food, but his eyes never left the path. Days turned into weeks. The weather got colder, and the leaves fell from the trees, blanketing the ground in red and gold. Rusty didn't budge. He stayed on that porch, day after day, night after night. Sometimes it rained, and his fur got wet and matted, but he didn't care. Sometimes the wind howled through the woods, making the house creak, but Rusty just huddled closer to the door, waiting. The neighbors kept feeding him. Mrs. Clara with her chicken, Mr. Tom from across the street with bits of bread. They'd talk to each other, their voices soft and sad. "Mark's not coming back," mister," Tom said one day, leaning on his fence. "He's abandoned that dog." "Shameful," Mrs. Clara nodded, wiping her hands on her apron. "Rusty doesn't think so. Look at him. He's still waiting. Loyal little thing." They'd watch Rusty sitting there, his tail barely moving now, his eyes dull but still hopeful. They couldn't bring themselves to take him away. It didn't feel right. This was his home, his spot, his wait. Weeks turned into months, and months stretched into years. 3 whole years passed, 3 long lonely years. Rusty's fur grew patchy, and his legs got stiff from sitting so long. He wasn't the bouncy little dog he used to be, but he never left the porch. The neighbors stopped whispering about Mark after a while. To them, he was gone, a memory, someone who'd walked out and left his dog behind. But Rusty didn't believe that. Deep in his heart, he knew Mark would come back. He had to. Mark had promised, hadn't he? "I'll be back soon," he'd said. Rusty held on to those words like they were a rope keeping him alive. Every sunrise, Rusty would lift his head, look down the path, and wait. Every sunset, he'd lie back down, his nose pressed against the door, dreaming of the day Mark's boots would crunch on the dirt again. The neighbors called him the dog who waits, and the story spread around town. People would drive by sometimes, slowing down to look at Rusty on the porch, a small brown shape against the faded wood. "That's dedication," they'd say, shaking their heads. "That's love." But Rusty didn't care about what anyone said. He didn't wait for food or attention or pity. He waited for Mark, the man who'd tossed the tennis ball, scratched his ears, and called him a good boy. The man who'd left with a black bag and a promise. Rusty didn't know where Mark had gone, or why. He didn't know about the woods or the secrets they held. All he knew was that Mark was his person, and Rusty would wait for him, no matter how long it took. And so, he stayed there, day after day, year after year, a loyal little dog on a creaky old porch, waiting for a man who might never come back. 3 years had passed since Mark walked away with that black bag, leaving Rusty alone on the porch. The little brown dog wasn't as young as he used to be. His fur, once soft and shiny like autumn leaves, was now patchy and dull. His legs ached from sitting in the same spot day after day, and his big hopeful eyes had grown tired. But Rusty never stopped waiting. Every morning, he'd lift his head, stare down the dirt path leading into the woods, and wait for Mark. Every night, he'd curl up by the door, his nose pressed against the crack, dreaming of his owner's return. The neighbors still brought him food, Mrs. Clara with her chicken scraps, Mr. Tom with bits of bread, but Rusty barely noticed. His world was the porch, the path, and the promise Mark had made, "I'll be back soon." It was a rainy night in late autumn when everything changed. The sky was dark, heavy with clouds that rumbled like they were angry. Rain fell in sheets, tapping hard against the roof of the little house, and soaking the porch where Rusty lay. The wind howled through the woods, bending the trees, and sending wet leaves swirling through the air. Rusty didn't like the rain much. It made his bones feel colder, but he stayed put, his head resting on his paws, his eyes half closed. He was used to bad weather by now. It didn't scare him off the porch. Then out of nowhere, a sound cut through the storm. It was faint at first, almost lost in the noise of the rain and wind. A thud low and heavy, like something falling to the ground. Rusty's ears perked up, twitching as he lifted his head. He turned toward the woods behind the house, where the sound had come from. His heart beat a little faster. He didn't know why, but something about that thud felt important. It wasn't just a branch snapping or a rock rolling down the hill. It was different, strange. Rusty stood up slowly, his stiff legs shaking under him. The rain dripped off his fur, making him shiver, but he didn't care. He stepped off the porch, his paws sinking into the muddy ground. It was the first time in 3 years he'd left his waiting spot. The neighbors, if they'd seen him, would have been shocked. Rusty, the dog who never moved, was walking away. But no one was watching. The town was asleep, tucked away from the storm, and Rusty was alone. He moved toward the woods, his nose low to the ground, sniffing. The rain made it hard to smell anything, but Rusty kept going. The thud echoed in his mind, pulling him forward like a rope. The trees loomed ahead, tall and dark, their branches swaying wildly in the wind. Rusty wasn't a brave dog, not the kind who'd chase off a bear or bark at strangers, but he loved Mark, and something told him this sound had to do with his owner. He had to find out. The woods were thick and messy, full of tangled roots and wet leaves. Rusty's paws slipped as he walked, but he didn't stop. The rain stung his eyes, and the wind pushed against him, but he kept moving deeper. Then he heard it again. Another thud, softer this time, closer. His ears flicked forward, and he picked up his pace, his old legs trembling with effort. He didn't know what he was looking for, but he felt it in his gut. Something was out here, something Mark had left behind. After what felt like forever, Rusty stopped. There, under a big oak tree, was a pile of wet leaves and mud. It didn't look like much, just a mess the storm had made. But then he saw it, a corner of something black sticking out from the pile. Rusty tilted his head, his heart thumping. He stepped closer and pawed at the leaves, pushing them aside. The rain helped, washing the mud away, and soon Rusty uncovered it, the black bag. It was the same one Mark had carried when he left 3 years ago. Rusty knew it right away. The shape, the way it sagged, even the faint clinking sound as he nudged it, it was Mark's. The bag was torn now, ripped along one side, and covered in dirt. Rusty sniffed it, his nose twitching. It smelled like earth and rain, but underneath, there was something else, something sharp and metallic. He pawed at it again, and the tear opened wider. Out spilled a rusty knife, its blade dull and stained with dark spots. Rusty didn't know what it was for, but it made him uneasy. Next came a small locket, round and silver, dangling from a broken chain. It popped open when it hit the ground, showing a picture of a woman Rusty had never seen. She had long hair and a soft smile, but her face meant nothing to him. Last, a crumpled piece of paper fell out, half soaked from the rain. Words were scribbled on it in Mark's messy handwriting. "I had no choice." Rusty stared at the bag, and its secrets, his tail still. He didn't understand what it all meant, the knife, the locket, the note, but he felt a chill that wasn't just from the rain. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. His Mark, the man he'd waited for, had left this here. Why? What had he done? Rusty's mind couldn't figure it out, but his heart ached with a new kind of sadness. He grabbed the bag strap in his teeth, and started dragging it back through the woods, his small body straining against the weight. The trip back was slow. The rain kept falling, the wind kept pushing, but Rusty didn't stop. He slipped and stumbled, the bag catching on roots and rocks, but he pulled it all the way to the porch. When he got there, he dropped it by the door and sat down, panting. The knife, the locket, and the note lay scattered in the mud, glinting faintly under the porch light. Rusty looked at them, then out at the woods, then back at the bag. He let out a soft whine, a small broken sound that carried all his confusion and fear. The storm raged on, but Rusty stayed quiet now, his eyes fixed on the black bag. He didn't know what he'd found, not really. He didn't know about crimes, or lies, or the dark truth hiding in those woods. All he knew was that this bag was Mark's, and it held something heavy, something that made his loyal little heart tremble. Rusty lay down beside it, his wet fur pressed against the porch, and waited. Not just for Mark now, but for answers he couldn't even name. The morning after the stormy night was cold and gray. The rain had stopped, but the ground was still wet, and puddles dotted the yard around Mark's little house. Rusty lay on the porch, his small brown body curled up next to the black bag he'd dragged from the woods. His fur was damp and matted, sticking to his skin, but he didn't move. The bag sat there, torn and muddy, with its strange contents spilled out. The rusty knife, the silver locket, and the crumpled note that said, "I had no choice." Rusty didn't understand what they meant, but he couldn't stop looking at them. His big eyes, once so full of hope, were cloudy now, like he sensed something bad had happened, something tied to Mark. The sun was just peeking over the trees when Mrs. Clara, the neighbor with the kind face and gray hair, stepped outside. She carried a bowl of leftover stew, meaning to leave it for Rusty like she always did, but when she saw him, she froze. Rusty wasn't in his usual spot by the door, waiting with his tail wagging. He was off to the side, next to that dirty black bag, staring at it like it was alive. Mrs. Clara squinted, her old eyes trying to make sense of it. "What's that you've got there, Rusty?" she muttered, stepping closer. When she saw the bag, and what was inside, her hand flew to her mouth. The knife, with its dull blade and dark stains, made her stomach turn. The locket glinted in the weak sunlight, and the note, though soggy, was clear enough to read. Mrs. Clara didn't touch anything. She'd lived long enough to know this wasn't just junk, it was trouble. "Oh, Rusty," she whispered, her voice shaking. "What did Mark do?" She hurried back to her house, her slippers slapping against the wet ground, and picked up the phone. "Tom," she said, when Mr. Tom answered, "you better come over and call the police. Something's not right." Within an hour, the quiet street was buzzing. Mr. Tom arrived first, his pickup truck rumbling to a stop. He was a big man with a beard, always grumbling about something, but his face went pale when he saw the bag. "That's Mark's," he said, scratching his head. "I remember him carrying it the day he left." Before long, 2 police cars pulled up, their lights flashing red and blue. Officers stepped out, their boots crunching on the gravel, and walked to the porch. Rusty didn't bark or growl, he just watched, his tail still, his body tense. The lead officer, a tall woman with sharp eyes, named Officer Hayes, knelt by the bag. She put on gloves and picked up the knife, turning it over in her hands. "This has blood on it," she said quietly to her partner, a younger man with a notepad. "Old but still there." She moved to the locket next, popping it open. Inside was the picture of a woman, long brown hair, a soft smile, maybe 25 years old. Officer Hayes frowned. "Looks familiar," she said, handing it to her partner. Then she smoothed out the note and read it aloud. "I had no choice." Her jaw tightened. "This isn't good." The police started asking questions. Mrs. Clara told them about Mark leaving 3 years ago, how Rusty had waited ever since. Mr. Tom nodded along, adding, "He was a strange one, that Mark kept to himself. Never saw him with anyone." Officer Hayes listened, then turned to the woods behind the house. "If Rusty found this out there," she said, "we need to look." She called for more officers, and soon a small team was trudging into the trees, their flashlights cutting through the morning mist. Rusty stayed on the porch, watching as the police worked. He didn't move, didn't wag his tail, didn't even sniff the stew. Mrs. Clara had left. His eyes followed the officers disappearing into the woods, and his ears twitched at every sound. Hours passed. The neighbors gathered across the street, whispering to each other, their voices a low hum. "What's going on? Did Mark do something?" Poor Rusty, stuck in the middle of it. But Rusty didn't hear them. He just waited, like always, though now it felt different, like he wasn't waiting for Mark anymore, but for something else. Then a shout came from the woods. "Over here," one of the officers yelled. The others rushed over, and Rusty's head snapped up. Officer Hayes came back first, her face grim. She carried a small evidence bag, but she didn't show it to anyone. "We found something," she told Mr. Tom and Mrs. Clara, keeping her voice low. "A shallow grave. Bones, clothes, what's left of someone. Been there a while." Mrs. Clara gasped, clutching her coat. "Who?" she asked, her voice trembling. Officer Hayes held up the locket. "We think it's her. Sarah Miller went missing 3 years ago. Same day Mark disappeared." The name didn't mean anything to Rusty, but the neighbors knew it. Sarah had lived a few miles away, a sweet girl who worked at the diner. She'd vanished one night, no trace, no clues. People thought she'd run off, maybe left town for a better life. But now the truth was sinking in. Mark hadn't just left Rusty, he'd done something awful. The knife matched the wounds on Sarah's bones, the police said later. It was him. Mark was a murderer. Rusty sat there as the police taped off the yard and carried things out of the woods. They took the bag, the knife, the locket, and the note, sealing them in plastic bags. Officer Hayes knelt by Rusty, for a moment, her hand hovering over his head. "You're a good dog," she said softly, but she didn't pet him. She stood up and kept working, her voice sharp as she gave orders. The neighbors watched, their faces pale, their whispers growing louder. Mark killed her, hid her in the woods. Left Rusty to wait. Rusty didn't move, his eyes darted between the woods and the porch, his little body trembling. He didn't know words like murder, or crime. He didn't know Sarah, or why she was gone. But he felt the weight of it all, the bag, the knife, the grave. The man he'd loved, the man he'd waited for, wasn't the person Rusty thought he was. Mark's hands, the ones that scratched his ears and tossed the ball, had hurt someone, killed someone, left her in the dirt. The sun climbed higher, but the day stayed cold. Rusty lay down, his head resting near where the bag had been. He let out a low whine, soft and sad, like he was asking why. The police kept working, The neighbors kept talking, but Rusty stayed quiet. His world had cracked open, and the dark truth was spilling out. Mark wasn't coming back, not the Mark he knew. And Rusty, the loyal little dog, didn't know what to do with that. The days after the police found Sarah's grave were quiet, but not the peaceful kind of quiet. It was a heavy, sad quiet that hung over Mark's little house, like a thick fog. The yellow police tape fluttered in the wind, stretched across the yard, and into the woods. The neighbors didn't gather anymore. They stayed inside, peeking through curtains, whispering about what Mark had done. Rusty, the small brown dog, with the big eyes, stayed on the porch. He didn't sit up like he used to, waiting for Mark with a wagging tail. Now he just lay there, his body pressed against the cold wood, his head resting near where the black bag had been. The bag was gone, now taken by the police along with the rusty knife, the locket, and the note. But Rusty could still see it in his mind, the torn black shape that had spilled out Mark's secrets. He didn't understand murder, or grave, or why Sarah had been buried in the woods. He didn't know what the police meant when they said Mark was a killer. But he felt it. Deep in his little heart, Rusty felt something break. The man he'd loved, the man he'd waited for 3 long years, wasn't the Mark he'd known. That Mark, the one who tossed the tennis ball and called him a good boy, was a lie. Mrs. Clara still came by every day. She'd bring a bowl of stew, or some scraps of bread, setting them down near Rusty. "Eat, sweet boy," she'd say, her voice soft and shaky. "You need your strength." But Rusty didn't touch the food. He'd look at it, his nose twitching faintly, then turn his head away. His eyes, once bright with hope, were dull now, like the light inside him had gone out. Mrs. Clara would sigh and sit on the porch steps, watching him. "He knows," she told Mr. Tom one afternoon, her hands twisting in her lap. "He doesn't understand it all, but he knows Mark did something terrible." Mr. Tom nodded, leaning against the railing. "Dogs feel more than we think," he said. "Rusty's grieving, waiting all that time for a monster." They'd look at Rusty, lying there like a shadow of himself, and their hearts would ache. The whole town felt it, the sadness of a loyal dog, betrayed by the one he loved most. People drove by slower now, glancing at the porch, shaking their heads. "Poor Rusty," they'd say. "What a shame." Night after night, Rusty stayed by the door. The weather turned colder, the wind sharper, but he didn't move. He'd stare at the spot where the bag had been, then out at the woods where Sarah's grave was found. Sometimes he'd nudge the porch with his nose, like he was looking for something. Mark's smell, maybe, or the memory of better days. But it was gone. Everything was gone. The tennis ball still sat in the yard, faded and covered in dirt, but Rusty didn't chase it anymore. It didn't mean anything without Mark's hand to throw it. One night, the sky was clear, full of stars that glittered like tiny lights. The town was asleep, the houses dark and still. Rusty lifted his head, his ears twitching. He stood up, his legs wobbly from lying so long, and looked out at the woods. Then he opened his mouth, and howled. It wasn't a bark or a whimper. It was a long, deep howl that rolled through the air, echoing off the trees. It was loud and sad, full of pain and confusion, like Rusty was crying out to the world. The sound woke Mrs. Clara, who stumbled to her window in her nightgown. Mr. Tom heard it too, stepping onto his porch with a flashlight. They listened, their eyes wet with tears, as Rusty's howl stretched on. "He's breaking," Mrs. Clara whispered, clutching her chest. "That poor, poor dog." The howl wasn't just noise. It was Rusty letting go of something. 3 years of waiting, 3 years of love, all poured into that sound. He didn't know how to say it, but he felt it. Mark had left him, not just by walking away, but by being someone Rusty couldn't love anymore. The howl faded, and Rusty sank back down, his head low, his breathing heavy. The neighbors went back inside, wiping their faces, unable to shake the sound from their minds. After that night, Rusty got quieter. He stopped looking at the path. He stopped sniffing the air for Mark's smell. The food piled up, bowls of stew and bread, left untouched until Mrs. Clara took them away. Rusty's fur grew thinner, his ribs showing under his skin. He wasn't sick, not in the way a vet could fix. He was fading, like a candle burning out. The neighbors tried to help. Mrs. Clara brought a blanket one day, draping it over him.
"You'll freeze out here," she said, her voice cracking. Rusty didn't move. Mr. Tom even tried coaxing him inside his house across the street. "Come on, boy," he said, patting his leg. "You don't have to stay here." But Rusty wouldn't budge. This was his porch, his home, his place to wait, even if waiting didn't make sense anymore. The truth had settled into Rusty's bones. Mark wasn't coming back, not as the man Rusty remembered. The police had said it, the neighbors had said it. Mark had killed Sarah, buried her, and run away. Rusty didn't know the details, but he felt the weight of it. The hands that had fed him scratched his ears, held the leash. They'd held that knife too. They'd hurt someone, ended her life, and left Rusty behind, to wait for nothing. It was too much for a little dog to carry, but Rusty carried it anyway, lying there day after day, silent and still. The town watched him fade. Kids would point from car windows, asking, "Why's that dog so sad?" Parents would hush them, saying, "He's been through a lot." Mrs. Clara started crying every time she saw him, and Mr. Tom stopped grumbling, just shaking his head instead. Rusty wasn't the bouncy mutt who chased balls and barked at squirrels. He was a shadow, a ghost of himself, trapped between love and loss. And so, Rusty stayed on the porch, not waiting for Mark anymore, but grieving for him, for the owner he'd loved, the lie he'd believed, and the truth that broke his heart. The stars kept shining, the wind kept blowing, but Rusty's world had stopped. He didn't know what came next. He just lay there, small and quiet, letting the sadness take him. Winter came to the small town, bringing frost that sparkled on the ground, and a chill that bit at the air. Rusty, the little brown dog, still lay on the porch of Mark's old house. His fur was thin now, patchy from the cold, and the sadness that had settled into him. His ribs poked out under his skin, and his big eyes, once so full of hope, stared blankly at the world. The neighbors hadn't given up on him. Mrs. Clara brought blankets and hot broth. Mr. Tom left bits of meat, but Rusty barely touched anything. He wasn't waiting anymore, not really. He was just there, a small shape on a creaky porch, caught in the shadow of the truth about Mark.
The police had been busy since they found Sarah's grave in the woods. For months they'd searched for Mark, chasing leads across the state. The town buzzed with rumors. Some said he'd fled the country, others thought he was hiding nearby, watching from the shadows. Rusty didn't know any of that. He didn't know the police had found a clue in the black bag's torn lining, a receipt from a gas station hundreds of miles away, dated a week after Mark left. It was enough to narrow their search, and finally, they got him. It was a cold, gray morning when the news broke. Officer Hayes, the tall woman with sharp eyes, led the arrest. They found Mark in a rundown apartment in a big city, far from the woods and the little house. He'd shaved his head and grown a scruffy beard, trying to look different, but his eyes gave him away, dark and hollow, just like the day he'd walked off with that bag. When they caught him, he didn't fight. He sat there, hands cuffed, staring at the floor. "I didn't mean to," he mumbled. When they asked about Sarah, it just happened. Back at the station, Mark told the whole story. Sarah had been his girlfriend, a secret he'd kept from everyone. They'd met at the diner where she worked, sneaking around for months, but one night, they fought loud and angry, over money and lies. Mark said she'd threatened to tell people about him, about things he'd done before, things he didn't want anyone to know. He panicked, grabbed a knife from the kitchen, and stabbed her. "I didn't plan it," he said, his voice flat. "I just lost control." Afterward, he buried her in the woods, packed the black bag with the knife and her locket, and ran. He left Rusty behind without a second thought. The police brought Mark back to town a week later. It was a quiet day, the sky heavy with clouds that promised snow. They drove him in a black van, his hands still cuffed, his face pale and tired. Word spread fast, neighbors peeked out windows, kids stopped playing in the street. Mrs. Clara heard from Mr. Tom, who'd heard from the postman, and she hurried to the porch. "They've got him, Rusty," she said, kneeling beside the dog. "Mark's back." Rusty lifted his head, his ears twitching faintly, but he didn't move. The van pulled up in front of the house, its tires crunching on the gravel. Officer Hayes stepped out first, her face stern, followed by another officer holding Mark's arm. Mark looked different, thinner, older, like the years had worn him down. His eyes darted to the house, then to the porch, where Rusty lay. For a moment, time seemed to stop. Rusty saw him. The little dog's tail flicked once, a tiny wag, like a memory of the old days stirring. Then it stopped. Mark stared back, his mouth opening slightly, like he wanted to say something. "Rusty," Mark said, his voice rough and low. He took a step forward, pulling against the officer's grip. "Hey boy," he reached out a hand, the same hand that had scratched Rusty's ears, tossed the ball, held the knife. Rusty's eyes locked on him. For a second it looked like the old Rusty might come back, the dog who'd waited 3 years, who'd loved Mark with everything he had. But then Rusty's lip curled, and a low growl rumbled in his throat. It wasn't loud, not fierce, just steady and deep, a sound that said everything. Mark froze, his hand dropping. "Rusty," he said, softer now, confused. But Rusty didn't stop growling. He stood up, his shaky legs holding him steady, and backed away from the edge of the porch. His eyes dull and tired, burned with something new, hurt, betrayal, maybe even anger. He didn't run to Mark, didn't wag his tail, didn't whine for attention. He just stared, growling low like he was seeing Mark for the first time, not his owner, but a stranger, a monster. Officer Hayes nodded to her partner. "Let's go," she said, pulling Mark back to the van. "He's done here." Mark didn't resist. He looked at Rusty one last time, his face twisting with something, guilt maybe, or shame, then turned away. The van door slammed shut, and they drove off, leaving dust swirling in the air. Mrs. Clara watched, tears in her eyes. "Good for you, Rusty," she whispered. "You don't need him." Rusty stopped growling. He stood there breathing hard, then turned away from the path where the van had gone. For the first time in 3 years, he stepped off the porch. His paws hit the cold ground, slow and careful, and he walked past the yard, past the faded tennis ball, past the woods where Sarah's grave had been. He didn't look back. The neighbors saw him go, Mrs. Clara clutching her coat, Mr. Tom leaning on his fence, and they didn't call him back. They knew he needed this. Rusty kept walking, his small shape disappearing down the road. The snow started falling then, soft flakes drifting from the sky, covering his tracks. No one knew where he went. Some said he found a new home, a quiet place with kind people who'd never hurt him. Others said he just kept going, looking for peace after all the pain. Mrs. Clara liked to think he was free now, away from the porch and the memories of Mark. Mr. Tom agreed, nodding silently, as he watched the snow fall. The little house stayed empty, the porch bare. The town moved on, talking less about Mark and Sarah, more about their own lives. But Rusty's story lingered, a tale of loyalty and loss, of a dog who waited for years, only to say goodbye when the truth came out. Wherever he went, Rusty carried his broken heart with him, a small brown mutt who'd loved too much and learned too late. And in the end, he walked away, leaving the past behind, searching for something new under the falling snow.